How's it going, everyone, and welcome to 4 Mile Ranch. Now today we're going to dive into a red dot review. This one is by US Optics, which is kind of cool to see them coming out with some cool new red dots. And this is their TSR 1X or 1 Power. Now this is a fun little red dot. Obviously there's a lot of different options for us shooters on the market right now. So I'm going to kind of dive into what makes this one unique and why it might be worth your while. I'll get into the pros and some of the cons with this optic and just give you my overall impressions. Now, speaking of which, just a quick administrative note, I've had this optic now for just over 3 months. US Optics approached me, asked if I'd be interested in taking it to the range a bit, kind of giving my thoughts and opinions on it. They are not going to review this video before I post it online for you all to see. I don't owe them any positive feedback. I don't necessarily owe them negative feedback either. I don't get to keep this optic, and they're not paying me anything, although I'd love to be a sponsored US Optics shooter. Unfortunately, I am not. Just having fun with the new toy on the range, and I'm gonna go ahead and share my thoughts. Now, in terms of the reticle, you have the single red dot in the center of this optic. There are 12 different brightness settings for this, and then 3 night vision compatible settings. Prior to using this, I had never touched anything larger than a 2, maybe 3 MOA dot, because I was under the impression that that would be too large, it would obstruct the target, and that I wouldn't like it. After using this, honestly, 5 MOA, I don't have any complaints. If anything, it makes that dot a little bit faster to acquire. I was still able to be plenty precise while shooting this, and I hardly noticed that it was in fact 5 MOA dot after getting used to it. Another cool feature with the reticle is that it will automatically shut off after 12 hours of use, or since you last hit a button, so that it's really hard to drain the battery on this. But good luck draining the battery on this anyways, because it has a battery life of 2 to 3 years. Obviously, I have not had this optic long enough to validate that, but depending on your use, they claim you'll get 2 to 3 years, which is definitely believable since it is just a nice single little LED on the inside of the optic. This optic is powered by your pretty standard 2032 battery, and it does have the same footprint of the Aimpoint T1, so for those of you that are already set up with Aimpoint style mounts, you're good to go there. It'll be compatible. And this entire optic is aluminum, so it feels pretty solid. It doesn't feel cheap, but we'll get into the build quality of this optic in just a little further into this video. So first things first, let's go ahead and dive into what you get with this optic right out of the box.
So you obviously get the optic itself, but more on that later. A nice skeletonized lower 1/3 co-witness mount, a low profile mount. You do get rubber lens covers, a needed Allen wrench for the mounts. You do get an owner's manual and US Optics sticker, a microfiber cleaning cloth. And what I find most interesting is you actually get a quality control card that is both dated when it was inspected and initialed by the given employee, where they go through a number of things to make sure the optic is good to go. Now the optic itself is pretty straightforward to set up. You go ahead and use the 4 set screws that are included. I was pleasantly surprised to see that they had already had Loctite applied to the threads, so you'll be good to go once you choose between the low profile or 1/3 co-witness mount. Now the 1/3 co-witness mount is going to be used on platforms such as AR-15s, so that you'll have a nice lower 1/3 co-witness with standard height iron sights. The low profile mount can be used on a variety of firearms, or it does give you the option to use it with a 45-degree offset mount as a backup optic to something like a magnified scope. The options are kind of endless, and it's really nice to see that they included both of these mount types to give you some flexibility on how you want to use this optic. Now zeroing this optic was just as easy. I simply removed the covers that double as a tool, and I co-witnessed on my AR-15, and it put me right on target and didn't miss a beat. Now you can always do it the old-fashioned way on paper, and you do have 1 MOA incremental adjustments with a total travel of 50 MOA in both windage and elevation.
Now, when looking into red dot optics, there's 3 main factors that I personally take into account. I'll go ahead and walk you through my considerations and explain to you why I think they're pretty important when considering a red dot optic specifically. Number 1 is going to be reliability and durability. It kind of goes without speaking, but we'll touch on it briefly. Obviously, if you have an optic that's going to fall apart on you or won't power on when you need it to power on, it really has no business being on a firearm. Now in terms of the durability and reliability of this optic, I have had zero issues in terms of this optic failing to power on or function as needed. The Zero held absolutely fine. There were no issues whatsoever. And in fact, since ammo was a little hard to come by, I did the only thing I could think of in terms of readily available ammo just to test this optic for its ability to handle shock and heavy vibration and a little bit of abuse. And that's 12 gauge.
And try as I might, I was unable to get the optic to show any signs of failure while mounting it to a 12 gauge and putting several boxes through. It stayed nice and bright and did not appear to shift in any way, and the mount did not loosen up whatsoever.
Now in terms of build quality, I do want to compare it to my Holosun just because again, they are a similar price point and similar form factor. I would say that the US Optics is significantly built better than the Holosun. The aluminum housing just feels like it's either a thicker walled aluminum or it's just a higher quality. The Holosun, although it is aluminum, it just, when you touch it, it almost feels borderline plasticky. Whereas when you touch the US Optics, it very much feels like it's aluminum. It feels much more solid. Now, one thing I did notice, again, while comparing it to the Holosun, is that the front of the Holosun actually almost appears to be kind of slanted and open. In fact, when I first unboxed my Holosun for the first time, I thought I had a faulty optic and that the lens was literally popping out, but it turns out that that's intentional and it's them trying to reflect that dot back towards the user's eye. Whereas the US Optics, it has a very slight cant, but it is pretty much sealed all the way around and doesn't look like it's broken right out of the box like the Holosun does. And it is also nicely sealed on the rear of the optic. So I'd say build quality wise, it definitely surpasses the Holosun in a similar price range, market and form factor. So now kind of going more into the reliability and the overall design of this optic. Again, specifically speaking to this form factor of optics, I personally keep an eye on how they decide to mount the battery on these optics. Now this one in particular kind of passes my initial just look over because the battery housing does not project severely from the optic. It's not a big protrusion that limits your view. So when you get behind this optic, it really does not get rid of some of your peripheral vision. The other consideration there is, would you drop this optic? How the battery is installed onto these things is pretty important. So again, since this is, I would say, it doesn't protrude much from the optic, when I took a closer look, the battery housing looks to be, for the most part, pretty embedded within this optic, almost as if the actual threads on the outside are part of the housing itself. Now, where these can vary, especially on a lower end optic, is those battery housings are sometimes just screwed into the outside of the optic housing, or very, very, I don't know how to put it, but they protrude a lot and there's a lot of stress points where if you were to drop it, that battery housing can totally snap off. And I'm not trying to throw other companies under the bus because this is about US Optics right now, but I have actually snapped battery housings off of lower end red dots after dropping them, whether intentional or not, for some of these videos. This one seems to be built very well. It doesn't have any wobble or shake, and I would suspect that would you drop it, again, intentional or not, it wouldn't break off. Now, I did not torture test this optic because I don't think US Optics wanted me to do that, but if they want me to go ahead and torture test this, I'll definitely do it. So now, that was my first point that I care about, is durability and reliability. The second one is actually parallax, and this is probably in order of most importance to least importance to me. Now, why is parallax important? Well, first of all, if you don't know what parallax is, it's basically when you get behind your rifle and you put a dot on target and you were to shift the position of where your sight picture is, how much does that dot just move around just because of, I guess, the optical illusions and the way the light is actually bouncing around before it gets to your eye. Now, if you have a lot of parallax, that can cause you to totally miss your target. So it can be a pretty big deal, especially depending on the distance that you are shooting. Now, one of the best examples I can give you as far as a parallax-free optic that kind of set the golden standard is EOTech. It's what they're pretty famous for, is the lack of parallax on their optics. So when you get behind an EOTech, wherever you see that dot, that's pretty much guaranteed where your rifle is aiming, assuming it is 0. Now, when comparing the parallax in this optic to EOTech, and again, only bringing EOTech into this because they kind of set that golden standard for parallax-free red dots, this one has just slightly more parallax than the EOTech, and I mean ever so slightly. I would say it's fairly negligible. I would not expect it to cause you to miss your target, even in the most extreme case of you really getting kind of funky behind that rifle. And now the third most important thing for me personally, for my personal application, is actually the clarity of the glass behind a red dot optic. Now you may wonder, well, is it really that important for red dot? It's not like it's a magnified optic. For me, yes, it is important, but I'm not really talking about the sharpness of the dot. I'm talking about the actual tint of the glass itself. Now, some can deal with some of the blue tinted or orange tinted glass. Me personally, it drives me crazy. A notorious example of that would be the Trigicon RMR, heavy blue tint. Now, personally, that was a deal breaker for me, and that's why I never picked it up. Why do I care about that? Well, let's say in the application of home defense, where you're already dealing with low light, do you really want to lose any more visibility than what's absolutely necessary? Personally, I'd rather keep as much visibility as I can. Another application, which is the bigger factor for me, because obviously I hunt more than I get into home defense firefights, thankfully. But for hunting purposes, I would never consider the Trigicon RMR because it's typically low light, especially hog hunting, and the RMR would just make it that much harder to track the hogs as they run. Now, this US Optics TSR 1X would do phenomenal. The glass is almost completely clear, very, very minimal tinting. In fact, comparing it to the EOTech, I'd say it's very comparable. And then another similar optic in terms of form factor would be like a hollow sun that I have been using pretty regularly on my Scorpion here. You can probably tell just by looking at it, possibly. It's got a pretty heavy orange tint from the front, and when looking through the optic, there is kind of a blue haze. It's not terrible. In fact, I was pleased with the amount of tint in this optic until looking through the US Optics TSR 1X, and it has significantly less tint, so much so that now I would probably prefer this over my hollow sun in terms of that factor. So again, for me, it's reliability and durability. No issues whatsoever with that. And then it is the parallax, or lack thereof, hopefully. This definitely passed with flying colors on that. And finally, clarity of the glass, which again, very pleased with this overall. Now, there's no such thing as a perfect optic, so let's go ahead and get into a few of the things that I wish could be improved on this optic. Number one, the thing I noticed right out of the gate is the lack of the 65 MOA circle option. So again, comparing it to the hollow sun that I have, because it's only fair since they are in the same price range. Hollow sun allows you to add that 65 MOA ring, similar to what you see on an EOTech. So why am I bringing that up? Well, because if you're going to compete in that market, I think you should have the same or improved options. US Optics only allows you to have the single 5 MOA dot. So maybe some of you guys don't like the 65 MOA ring. Me personally, I usually opt to leave it on in my hollow sun because I feel like my eye can pick it up a little faster than a single dot. That being said, it is a 5 MOA dot in the US Optics offering, whereas the hollow sun is the 1 MOA dot. So it kind of makes up for it in that sense in terms of target acquisition. Another thing that I'm not exactly thrilled, although so far it has completely passed the reliability portion of my testing with flying colors, and they're not the only ones to do it, but it's this single little set screw in the mount. I feel like it's kind of risky to put basically all your faith in a single little screw. Would you really bang this? All that's gotta fail is a single screw. It'd be nice to see an additional set screw. Granted, it's one more thing that you had to tighten down, keep track of, put Loctite on, whatever. But it's one more thing that's keeping you from potential failure. So I think that's pretty important personally. That being said, they're not the only ones doing it. There's a handful of mounts that only have one screw. I think, until it becomes an issue, it's not an issue, but that could change. Like I said, me personally, I like to see more than one little piece of hardware. That being said, it is connected to the mount with 4 set screws, so you're pretty solid there. So other than that, I'm trying to keep it as short and sweet while being as informative as possible. overall, I had a pretty positive experience with this optic. No issues to report, only minor nuances that me just being nitpicky can really complain about. I think it's a great buy for the price point. As always, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to stop by the 4MR Ranch YouTube channel, and as always, have a good one.